And Kate to click the go live button. Click. And we're live. It is Wednesday, April 21st, 2021, 5:01 p.m. And we have a split show today. The first half of the show, we have Rashawn Ray here. You've seen him on the show before. We're talking, of course, about the Chauvin verdict yesterday and what it means and what it doesn't mean. In the second half of the show, I asked Tim Miller to come on because he has been tracking this, the almost unbelievable and yet completely unsurprising right-wing reaction to this verdict. And I thought that would be an interesting, what the Bulwark folks call the anti-chauvinism is a very interesting element of the, I suspect, the politics of the next couple years. We're not allowed to have fun anymore, but apparently neither is Derek Chauvin, which is something positive. Rashawn, welcome back to the show.
Thank you all for having me. I look forward to continuing the conversation that we've been having, over the past several months.
So let's start with the proceeding itself. You and I talked right at the beginning of the trial on Lawfare Live. What was your reaction to the conduct and manner in which the trial itself played out from the beginning through the verdict?
So I think it's a few things that people should know. This case is, or was, now that it's over, even though the sentencing still has to happen, this case was an outlier and an exemplar, but not the norm. What do I mean by that? Well,
yeah, that's like a lot to unpack. But I actually followed your distinctions, I think. So I'm interested to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, I mean, look, it has all the makings of what we would want to have happen. So not only was it ample video evidence, not just from the teenager, but body-worn camera footage from several officers, including an officer across the street. There was also street video footage. We also had an all-star prosecution team that Attorney General Keith Ellison put together from across the state with a ton of resources that typically does not happen in cities and counties when prosecuting these type of cases. There were also a slew of medical experts and a smorgasbord of law enforcement officers who testified against Chauvin. You put all those factors together. Oh, in addition to a racially diverse jury, which racial diversity is important because it creates equity and transparency and accountability. And when there is at least one Black person on the jury, based on a study out of Florida of 700 felony murder trials, the likelihood of a Black person or a white person being found guilty is roughly the same. But when there are no Black people in the jury pool, Black people are significantly more likely, about 20% more likely to be killed by police. I mean, to be found guilty after committing or allegedly committing a crime. So look, this was a slam dunk. Make no mistake. But what people wondered when they saw the ball go in the net is whether or not the points were going to count on the scoreboard. And that feeling is racism in America.
So what do you mean by that? When people see the ball go through the net, that moment is the moment of conviction? Or, I mean, is your concern a reversal on appeal, or that he will get very little time? Walk me through the nature of that anxiety.
Yeah, I think that last part could definitely be that. I mean, I think for people, what happened is that they saw George Floyd murdered on film, but they wondered whether or not the person who actually, they were wondering if the person who actually did the murder was going to be held accountable to the murder. And we also know there are huge differences between being convicted of manslaughter versus second or third degree murder. So people wondered if the points were going to count. Like it was three charges, whether or not they were all going to stick. And then, of course, we have to pay attention to the sentencing. And then, of course, we have to pay attention to the appeal. And we also need to pay attention to the other officers who were charged in this incident, because it's unclear as of now what's going to happen to them.
So I took it to mean, when you were saying that, and tell me if I'm wrong, I mean, I thought, and maybe this is too like on the nose, I just thought that just pure, plain and simple, that the thin blue line was going to hold, and that there was going to be an exceptionalism, not just based on race, but based on the fact that Chauvin was police, and that there is a strong, like that there is all of this deference to police, and like the historically through the courts, whether that's racist or not, like another conversation, but it's there. And so that the law can be turned to basically like try to convince people to allow to that this wasn't murder too, because this was something that a police officer was doing. And so what was like kind of, how was that unpacked specifically and addressed in the trial, like by the jury? Because I was thrilled, obviously, with this outcome. I just was like, that's what I was worried about. Whether or not, you know, it was going to be racism, or whether it's not driven by racism, anyone could argue that. But generally speaking, we know that like courts defer to the police.
Well, you know, what you just described is what makes it an outlier, you know, is that, I mean, typically police officers do not testify against other people, against each other.
Yes.
Case in point, let's take the killing of Freddie Gray in Baltimore. The police chief and other officers testified for the defense. So you know, we have to think about, again, that's more normative than what we just saw. So the number of officers who testified, but again, I think for a lot of law enforcement, they viewed this as a dark day in law enforcement. They viewed Chauvin as the worst of them, as the villain of villains, that he's different than we are. And because of that, they were willing to allow him to fall on the sword and then say, all right, we did that. We held one of ours accountable. Yeah. Let's get back to work. And the problem with getting back to work, as usual, is that
it happens all over again.
Yeah, and never stopped. Over 60 people have been killed by police since the Chauvin trial started. Over 60 people. I want people to think about that. Yes, this trial was on TV every day, but it wasn't super duper long. Like, I mean, over 60 people to be killed during the time of the Chauvin trial. I mean, it's pretty telling.
So I want to get back to that question in a moment. But when you say this was an outlier, you've identified several factors that make it outlying. It seems to me they all flow from one factor, which is the video, and how horrible that video was, and how you can't, although as we'll hear from Tim later in the show, a lot of people are doing it. You can't watch that video and come away from it with a serious question about whether this was a murder. But I want to hold out the possibility that you know, maybe the explanation here is that Keith Ellison is a serious guy, right? Maybe the explanation is that they devoted a lot of resources to it, as you say, pulled stuff from around the state. Do you think if killing happens in Minnesota tomorrow, and one happened the other day, you know, so it's not that hypothetical, and you don't have that video, the system snaps back to the way it normally responds? Or do you think, you know, Minnesota authorities have unlearned certain reflexes in connection with this case and developed a certain different set of reflexes? Or is it all about the video?
Yeah, I think it's mostly about the video.
Yeah, I do too.
I think it snaps back. Yeah, I mean, I think the video drives the show here. Now, I will say that video did catapult the things that you mentioned, and I think it particularly is catapulting the Department of Justice investigation.
Yeah, so do you feel like that's going to carry the ball post like through the net, like that's a great sign that we're going to be doing like sending signals federally?
Yes, most definitely. I mean, look, consent decrees, in addition to some of the other things, that I've talked about and that I wrote recently for Lawfare about police department insurances and qualified immunity, consent decrees is one of the main ways to make changes in policing. Let's have a little history here. Consent decrees are fairly recent, past what at this point, 2-3 decades, right? It's a recent thing. George W. Bush had some that were really important. President Obama had even more. Donald Trump had zero. Okay, zero. It could be argued that based on what we know about Minneapolis, they probably should have had a consent decree 2 years ago, at least, right? You had Philando Castile, you had Mrs. Diamond, who was killed, who was coming out just to say something, and she ended up being killed. That officer was convicted in her killing, and so we have these incidents, and yes, the consent decrees are going to matter. It's not just going to matter in Minneapolis; it's going to matter in other places. Let me tell you why. Not just because of misconduct and police brutality, but also because of internal issues. See, one thing I know about policing is that when there are problems in cities with use of force, it's normally internal problems, oftentimes racial problems internally within the police department. And so there are a lot of complaints from police officers who are trying to crack the blue wall of silence, but they do not feel comfortable, nor should they, telling their superiors about the things that have happened. As I wrote about, those officers who are quote unquote good officers who blow the whistle become either pushed down or pushed out of law enforcement. And all those cases are sitting at DOJ right now.
Yeah, there are also Title VII cases, honestly. So they come up in Title VII cases where you have, and it's really interesting. I handled a few of them when I was clerking on the Second Circuit. But just like I completely agree with you. It was like I just didn't know anything about this culture, and then reading an entire giant case file about it, it was like you can put it all together about like what's happening in this precinct, and you're like, wow, this is crazy.
It's crazy stuff. Like it is literally crazy stuff. Like, I mean, crazy stuff like a way to intimidate an officer when he was trying to say that this other officer did something bad in the field was the guy peed on his desk. Like so imagine you come into work and there's urine on your desk, like there has been an animal that peed on your desk, but instead it was a human being that peed on your desk. I mean, I could go on and on about some of the wild things.
So just to be clear, Kate, this presents as a Title VII issue because
people are either
somebody are suing for race discrimination
for racial discrimination and racial discrimination in firing or non-promotion or non-promotion. So sorry if that was confusing to people. Yes, so that's how it comes up as a Title VII, is that you have a perfectly qualified Black officer that has complained about exactly what Rashawn is talking about, and there is retaliation within the precinct to deny him promotion to things that he should absolutely get, like just textually, like he has gone and gotten his law degree also, and he's Black, and he's complained about the use of force by other police officers, and so he's never promoted, like time and time for like 7 years, not promoted like from his position, and then he files a Title VII action.
So, now we have Merrick Garland go out and announce this investigation. I assume that Kristen Clark will be confirmed relatively soon and will therefore lead it, although there's some degree of controversy. I mean, people are trying to gin up controversy about Kristen's nomination. I assume that it's pretty hard to run this investigation in a serious way without Senate confirmed leadership at the Civil Rights Division, right? I mean, it's kind of like it's going to be a pretty tentative. You can do it, but you kind of want your team in place. I would think if you're Merrick Garland and you're going out there and making a major announcement of, a pattern and practice investigation involving, a high profile case like this, you want your people there.
Yeah, I mean, and everyone knows that, and we have to be clear that, like, I'm currently doing some analysis with Samantha Elizado, who's a research assistant at Brookings. And I mean, we're just looking at patterns over time with Senate confirmations. And I mean, when it comes to women of color, it's pretty interesting. I mean, overall, it's political polarization, right? But we're also very interested in the length of time it takes for them to get confirmed, even if they ultimately do. And right now, I mean, there are women of color that are waiting. And the Department of Justice, of course, is a big deal here. People know that there are so many investigations and complaints sitting at DOJ that, I mean, it's just going to be, I mean, it's going to open the floodgates on law enforcement, and certain people are trying to prevent that, because this is why as well. Not only is it going to happen in states like Minnesota, where as people are very clear that, look, if you're white, life is great. If you're black, life isn't so great. But there are tons of other states that fit that same mold. But this is the thing. Minnesota is actually trying to do something about it. There are other states that want to do nothing about it. And the only thing that's going to be able to happen is for a consent decree to come in and address that, because cities nor the state legislature is going to do it.
So what is the next step, right? I mean, I think in some ways you look at yesterday and you say, okay, it's good that we got this verdict, because failure to get this verdict would have been a disaster and probably would have seen some very unfortunate immediate consequences, but also it just would have sent a message. It doesn't matter how strong the case is, you can never get a conviction in a police murder case. The Justice Department comes out and says they're going to do a pattern and practice investigation. That's good. What's the next step? Like, what's the thing that should happen tomorrow to keep the momentum going in the right direction?
Well, I think the main thing is that the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act should have a vote in the Senate.
And what is that? What does that consist of? What are the major provisions of that?
So the main thing is that it repeals qualified immunity, which is the court's doctrine that allows for police officers to not face civil culpability. Yep. It also creates a couple of federal databases, one of use of force. That's important because only 40% of the roughly 18,000 law enforcement agencies submit use of force, and in particular deadly force incidents to the federal government. Only 40%. And then it also creates a database of bad apples, so that officers like Timothy Loman, for example, or even these officers, the other three, say if they're convicted, but they don't really spend a whole bunch of time in jail, they get out, they want to be a cop again, this list will prevent them from being able to do it. And then, of course, there's low-hanging fruit that Republicans and Democrats ultimately agree on, not only the databases, but banning chokeholds and, requiring body-worn cameras and training and, banning no-knock warrants, those sort of things. So that's the first big thing. And honestly, I think if that legislation passes and then states replicate a lot of what's in that is the next step that should happen. The state of Maryland has moved in this direction. They passed the Maryland Police Accountability Act that removed the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights, which essentially allows for qualified immunity to go on steroids.
Yeah. That was nuts. That Maryland law, I remember when it was passed. Actually, it was early '90s, mid '90s, and that's a horrible law. Yeah. I mean, it basically says you're not allowed to interview a cop in an officer-involved shooting within a certain period of time. It basically suspends all the rules of normal investigative practice. And exactly. It was a police union bill that it was not a set of issues that I was following closely when it was passed, but it was. I remember it as like, boy, that's a terrible idea.
Yeah.
Then, and it's kind of nice to see it gone. All right.
Can I ask a quick question before we go to questions? So Rashawn, I actually am you said before, and I quoted, and the only thing I have tweeted about this, everything that's happened in the last 24 hours is George Floyd's younger brother standing up at the press conference and saying, without cameras, this couldn't have happened. Without cameras, like, this couldn't happen. And you said that one of the reforms is body cameras. We've had, like, there's obviously like very long standing controversy around body cameras used by police and everything else. So let's just assume citizen cameras. Without citizen cameras, this couldn't happen. And like on cell phones, but we had citizen cameras like in the early days with Rodney King, and had no effect. Like you could basically say that like it didn't do enough. Is it just like, do you think that there has been a normative change in how people perceive racial justice since Rodney King, and the technology has become ubiquitous? Or do you think that the technology has shown us how these racial crimes are so ubiquitous? Like the fact that we have like a list of names is just so powerful compared to having one name like Rodney King. Like, I'm really curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I mean, so I've examined millions of tweets on Twitter related to the Black Lives Matter movement, and I think a lot of this should be credit to the movement for Black Lives. See, part of what's happened is over the past 9 years since Trayvon Martin was killed, they've been doing the ground social movement organizing work, in particular to use social media to circumvent traditional modes of communication. And part of what they've done is they've curated content to where when you use the hashtag Black Lives Matter or police brutality, videos pop up. What pops up? Not just videos of Black people being disproportionately brutalized, but white people engaging in similar actions, not being brutalized as much. See that's the other part, right? Is that it's not simply about Black people being brutalized, it's about white people not. So like after Dante Wright was killed, and even yesterday there was this video of this a white man who literally had police officers hanging on his truck. He was driving down the street after he had been stopped for something. They didn't shoot him not once. Not once. So part of it, yes.
Yeah, I mean, and we all watched January 6th, where
like of course a whole bunch of people didn't die.
A whole lot of people didn't get shot.
Exactly. So yeah. So people had we're in this racial awakening, and people have become what I call racial equity learners. They're learning more, and it bothers them. For good people, just for normal people who try to live their life well, they're like, hold up, what the heck? Like after they go through the sequence of all of the justifications of why this could have happened, they're like, I don't understand why this happened. We need to do something about it.
Yeah, bless. I think that's exactly right. And this is what I love technology for, because I think that for all of the harms that it creates, and I think there are so many. I think it is undercredited how much technology has mobilized over a period of time movements like Black Lives Matter and like everything that's happened. And I think that it's ultimately just so for the good. Yeah.
Christopher, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Dr. Ray, great to see you back on the show. So my question, I was interested in your thoughts and the difference between accountability and justice, because it seemed like those people calling for this was justice for George Floyd. I mean, justice for George Floyd would have been, he was still alive. And so I'm wondering whether you think, what are your thoughts on accountability versus justice?
Yeah, good question, Chris. Nice to see you. So, all right, I'll say this in two ways, because I've heard some of my colleagues who I'm very fond of, and on the media. I think in many ways it's semantics. Look, I think that people literally mean very similar things. Okay, what they mean is that there was justice for George Floyd, like someone faced a penalty. Others are like there's accountability for Derek Chauvin for what he did. I think overall what people are ultimately saying, once we get past the language, is that one individual officer being held accountable does not change the system. And what we need to have happen is a system level change. And that's where the real justice lies, where we don't even have trials where Black people are disproportionately killed by police to begin with, which I think comes from accountability.
Yeah.
All right, Daniel, the floor is yours.
I am wondering whether you think armed law enforcement should be making routine traffic stops.
Oh my God, what a great question.
Yeah, really good question. Okay, so this is what I think. I think that there are a couple of things, and this is actually related to defund the police, because one of the things that advocates for defund the police talk about is reallocating traffic stops. There is some merit to that. Why? It's a couple of reasons. First, traffic stops are oftentimes low-level things that don't require police intervention. That's the first thing. The second thing is that if you live in most major metropolitan areas, the police don't even respond when you have a minor accident. They don't even come. And you know why they don't come? Because they are overwhelmed with other responsibilities. Things actually that we want them to focus on, like more violent crimes, investigations, right? Solving the crimes, because 40% of homicides go unsolved every year. And so to specifically answer your question, what would that look like? Well, I think similar to what happens on college campuses, similar to what happens in other public places, you have other people who handle those type of traffic stops, similar to how we can have mental health specialists respond to mental health calls. Denver is the best example of this. They have a program called STAR. It is pretty much one of the best programs I've ever seen. Montgomery County actually has a really good program as well, even though we could talk through the details of Montgomery County. But nonetheless, I think there are merits to that particular proposition.
It is still the case that even cops responding in violent crime situations in the UK don't carry weapons.
Exactly.
I don't think, given the prevalence of guns in the United States, that's a plausible model here. But I do think the basic principle that an enforcement officer who doesn't need to be armed shouldn't be armed is a pretty good starting place. When we have parking enforcement officers don't walk around with guns, and a lot of traffic enforcement can be done by through the mail at this point. And
and we already know that people get pulled over for driving while Black, but there's a disproportionate traffic enforcement that happens against Black people. And so, I mean, I completely agree with this. I also just think that, like, to your point, Rashawn, I think to double foot stomp it is like kind of the idea that, like, well, why are they spending time with like individuals on traffic enforcement or something? That's like where counties and other things make their money. Exactly. So that's why they're delegating resources there. Like,
exactly.
Yeah.
Bingo.
Backlit Alice, the floor is yours.
I love your apartment, Alice. It looks lovely. Don't listen to Ben.
Thank you. So my question was, I'm wondering how, let me know if this isn't the complete set of people who can hold police departments accountable. But if I break it down between local elected officials and people at the federal level, and so I guess DOJ probably specifically, how does their responsibility overlap, or what are they kind of separately responsible for? Especially when we have or had a Department of Justice that was willing to just let a lot of cases. I mean, you said that there was a large backlog. So do you mean
at the legal level, who's responsible for what, or
who can push change?
Yeah.
In whatever way, like should you be focused on making sure that we don't have an administration like the former one that will just not deal with these cases, or is it more important to focus on changing things at the local level in terms of impact on police misconduct?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the way I think about it is and both. But part of thinking about that is how would they work together is, I think, ultimately, I think what your question so profoundly articulated. So the way I think about it, consent decrees is one way. Another way is, okay, let's take good apples, as we were talking about. We were talking about why they don't report things. Well, in a lot of states, and Maryland's Police Accountability Act did this, they now, they were trying to do this. Let me be specific, because I testified on that legislation. They were trying to do this. I think it's going to eventually pass, which is mandating duty to intervene. Okay. Duty to intervene means that officers step in when someone is being mistreated. They're required to do so. The reason why they don't is because they don't have any protections. So at the state level, which is where I think a lot of things can runs through to policing, is at the state level, you can have an independent investigative body that handles complaints and incidents on behalf of police officers, because you cannot have it done at the department level. It's too specific. They get in trouble a lot. And I think that is a big place to hold bad apples accountable, because they then run through that. They get put on these state databases. They then get put on the federal databases. And those are some of the things that happen.
Yeah, so just at a purely legal level, Alice, the answer is that the vast majority of police misconduct cases are not in and of themselves federally prosecutable. There are certain examples will violate federal civil rights law, but frankly, you got to really work to do that. The thing that the federal government has two really critical roles here. One is that if you can pass federal law, you can create uniformity across jurisdictions. That, if you could pass a chokehold ban, that'd be better if you could do it at the federal level than if you just do it in Minnesota, because, for obvious reasons, that affects everywhere. The second key issue is this issue that Rashawn just mentioned, which is the federal government does have the power under the civil rights law to come in and look at the patterns and practices of local police departments and examine whether they are complying at a policy level with federal civil rights law. And it has the ability, sometimes by suing, sometimes by threatening to sue, to go in and get these consent decrees that are basically, we agree to follow the following rules and to not use the following practices. So it's a really, really powerful instrument, but it's almost never about the individual incident. So Derek Chauvin kills George Floyd. That's a matter of Minnesota law, and that's just a murder under Minnesota law. It's not, in and of itself, it's not a federal issue. The behavior of Minneapolis police toward the black community in general is a federal civil rights issue. That's a somewhat too simplistic way to describe it, but it's a good working rule. So it is now 5:30, which is when Tim said he could show up and when Rashawn said he had to go.
Wait, Tim's talking. You have to unmute Tim.
You have to unmute yourself, Tim.
So
You have to unmute yourself for real.
There you are. I can hear you.
Rashawn,
Hey,
you're awesome. Is what I keep saying. And could you please write something for the Bulwark? I'm writing about this tomorrow, and I'm out of my depth. You're killing it, and I would love to have you, come chat with us about it sometime.
let's talk. Yeah, shoot me an email.
Sure. All right, I will.
I like
Connect you
both of you a
guys.
lot, so this would be great. I would love to see this happen.
Rashawn, you're a great American. It's great to see you.
Thanks for doing all the bits you're doing on the TVs.
Yeah, go do media more important than us.
Yeah.
No. Thank you all for having me. This is great. I love our conversation. So, Ben, when you
they're
reached out, I was like, yeah, we got to figure this out. So thank you
glad.
all.
Thank you so much for doing
Enjoy.
it.
Soon.
All right. Bye. Have fun, Tim.
So Tim, you're
As my second favorite guest of the day, how do you feel?
Ouch, this is tough. Next time you have me in the second half hour, could you have one of your boring guests like Scott Shapiro or something like that on the first half so that I can kind of bring in the energy afterwards?
Oh man.
So here's my question. Why am I shocked? So if you had told me 6 weeks ago, all right, Derek Chauvin's going to go on trial, what's going to happen on the right by the end of it? I would have said, like, the David Frenches will be totally routed and there will be a pro-Chauvin contingent. And I would have been sort of joking. but only sort of. And that's exactly what happened. And I'm completely shocked by it. The tweets that you guys, that Ben Parker posted this morning on the Bulwark, and for those who haven't seen them, check. I'm going to share this in the chat. It is genuinely shocking what these people are saying. So, like,
yeah. The Daily Wire, which is Ben Shapiro's outlet, is like basically on the hunt for the real killer of George Floyd. I mean, like they're that far gone.
No, you're joking. That's a joke.
I mean, it's a joke
It's
in that
sort
like
of a joke.
it's sort of a joke in the sense that they're not searching for another killer like OJ did, but it's not a joke in the sense that they are like, they range from actively feeling like Chauvin is innocent and being pro-Chauvin to being extremely upset at the anti-Chauvin people, the anti-Chauvin position. Like this is Ben Shapiro. This is the mainstream of the right now. Like Ben Shapiro is not alt-right. Like this is not Gateway Pundit. This is not even,
What is alt-right now?
Right, exactly.
I guess.
What I'm saying is like, you can't even say, oh, that's just the Federalist. You know what I mean? Like Ben Shapiro is the most trafficked, the most popular right-wing commentator, particularly for people, 25 to 45. And his outlet, he himself took the position that, basically they were bullied. The jury was bullied into making this decision as if these 12 people in the jury weren't capable of watching a 9-minute video where a murder happened and saying that's a murder. They had to be bullied by Maxine Waters. That's Shapiro's position. Matt Walsh, as you could see in this article, I mean, he's another one of them. Said that a mob successfully intimidated the jury. He said that that George Floyd is the most famous drug overdose victim in history. I mean, this is insane stuff. All of the Candace Owens is at the Daily Wire now. She was on Tucker last night saying this. So this is just the view on that part of the conservative media. Now there are the eggheads, your David Frenches, your Seth Mandels, right? Like they didn't feel that way. There were a few examples, even that asshole at National Review, Andy McCarthy, the Legal Eagles, were pretty responsible, frankly. But the entertainment commentariat pundit wing was all either pro-Chauvin or anti-Chauvin.
So help me out with this, because I am, my ability to anticipate the emotional direction of what's now the mainstream right is limited. But I would think, if I were, imagine for a minute that you changed the last name Wittes to Shapiro. So it was, you merged me and Scott Shapiro and you got somebody named Ben Shapiro who was not insane.
Yeah.
Maybe who was, whatever racism lay in my heart. I would be pretty careful about looking at a video like that. And maybe in my heart was saying, oh, he probably fucking deserved it. But I would feel inhibited from saying something like that because, watching a 9-minute video of somebody, it's basically a snuff film. It's really hard to watch, and watching that and then coming away from it and saying, yeah, he probably died of a drug overdose. A jury that would consider it beyond a reasonable doubt that was a murder was clearly intimidated by Maxine Waters. It's not a good look. And so my question is, leaving aside what's in their hearts, which I think is pretty evidently pretty bad, when did they lose the ability to say, we can't say that? Like, maybe you whisper that to each other, or, in your Slack channel, you say something like that, but you actually don't say it in public because, people expect you not to do that, and they expect a certain homage that vice will pay to virtue?
Well, look, I mean, I think everything can you can blame everything on the bad orange man, right? And I think that it's true to say that he,
which is not Ben, despite his T-shirt today.
Yeah, let everybody felt more comfortable letting their freak flag fly, I think, after Trump, for sure. I'll say this, though. Ben has always been like this, honestly. I mean, Ben was would send out every year on Trayvon Martin's birthday a tweet that said, had Trayvon Martin not attacked George Zimmerman, he'd still be alive today.
I did not know that.
What?
I don't follow Ben Shapiro.
I know. This is what I'm saying. So, they were all. So here's what I think is that. Here's what I would say.
What does he see the trajectory of history as? That this is going to be the right side of it. I mean, or maybe he's not even thinking about.
Well, I mean, I think that he thinks that whatever BLM is socialists and all the socialists are monsters and Marxist monsters. I don't know. I mean, there's obviously an element of racism to it, but I think that there is also just this, people that have been very online and very in these fights, right? And it is true that not all of these cases have been black and white, right? Pun not intended.
It's clear.
Although the Trayvon Martin case was black and white.
Yeah, it was.
That was actually
that was
clear.
a simple one.
I think that so then over time, if you're always in these fights, like people like Ben have been, and I'm just going to say the entire Republican conservative entertainment wing writ large. It's like these are not people who are necessarily policy heavyweights. They are entertaining an audience, Fox, talk radio. The big name pundits. So let's just put them all in a bucket. You've been in all these fights going back to Ferguson. You feel like the hands up, don't shoot thing wasn't really true. And, then you're getting into all these fights one at a time and you instinctually go into your corner. So you instinctually go into the corner of, I'm going to have to defend the cop in this situation. And so and I'm going to have to find a reason why this victim was bad. Like why they, had a drug crime sometime or why they, had a sexual assault, crime sometime. And you find a reason, you find a reason to find the worst of the other team, right? And you find a reason to justify the actions of your team, right? I mean, it was that old,
No, it's identity protective. No, it's just I completely get it. But it doesn't make it right. It's just
it doesn't make it right. I'm just going to explain. And so then you get into the George Floyd situation, and I think that they're broken at this point. They're they can't get out of this mindset of this is a war. That's what Andrew Breitbart used to say. We're in a war. It's us against the media. # war. We are in a war, and we've picked our side, and our side in this war is the cops. For whatever reason, and so we're going to defend Derek Chauvin, even in the most insane instance of it. I mean, this is me putting them on the couch, obviously, but that's how I answer your question: is that they've just retrenched so far into their corner in this fight. And I just think really quick before you talk, the supportive point of this, I think, is there is a big gap between what Republican politicians, particularly Trump era politicians in the Republican Party, and what was said in conservative media. If you notice in that article Ben did, it was not Richard Burr wasn't saying, or you know what I mean? Republican politicians, except for Marge Green and the worst of the worst, pretty much put out statements that were either neutral, the jury has spoken type statements. Some of them even went so far as to say justice has been done. The Republican politicians' statements were kind of in this mold of respecting, the kind of thing you would expect from a politician. And so I think that that's a very telling gap, right? And I don't think it tells us a good thing about where things are going.
So I just want to say we did this accident. I want everyone to know that this was we had someone else that was going to be coming on and they couldn't come on. For childcare reasons, and we had Rashawn and Tim come on, and I didn't anticipate it, Ben, but this is like an insanely interesting dichotomy. Like, this is so interesting to hear from like Rashawn and like everything he studies, and like then to hear from like kind of what the crazy right is saying. Like, I think it's like anthropological. It's very like, it's like a survey. I just think that it's been I'm learning a lot. Sorry, honestly.
So I want to focus on the single craziest element of this crazy shit, which is the attempt among some of the people that you are the anthropologist of, that tribe, that remote tribe that you have gone in to study, that is trying to create an equivalence between the Chauvin case and the shooting of Ashley, I forget her last name, the woman who was killed at the Capitol. Ashley Babbitt. And so for those viewers who have not followed this, there is an idea on the right, in the nether regions of the right that we're talking about, that there is some parallel to be drawn between the killing of Ashley Babbitt on January 6th. Remember, she was attacking the Capitol and trying to barge through a police line through a barred door to get into the House chamber where, to kill people and lynch the vice president. And the killing of George Floyd. And I'm interested whether you have a sense of where this idea came from. How did we end up with large numbers of people who think that is a remotely valid comparison? I have wondered a fair bit over the last few months.
Okay, I'm ready. I love these questions when it's like, can you get inside the head of the crazy right? Because sometimes I'm like, I really can't. On this one, I got it. I'm like 2 for 2. I feel like, here's the answer. They don't actually care about the merits, right? Like, Ashley Babbitt is a pawn in this big game, in this big argument game, where it's like, oh, the left is upset about police shootings of black people. Why is not the left upset about Ashley Babbitt? Is it because she's white? Is it because she's a Trumper? I mean, you see this after any. Now, I think this is the biggest sign of a break in our culture, by the way, because you see this some on the left too, which is after you hear news of a mass shooting, and immediately people are kind of like rooting for it to be the other tribe, to be the
tribalism
shooter.
Is super weird.
Whatever. Like that. So yeah, but you get this in police shootings, right? Where if the victim is white, then you get immediately the sort of right-wing trolls being like, will anybody protest for this person? And, da-da-da-da-da. So I think that Ashley Babbitt is merely a pawn in this game for them. And so, I don't think that they're really trying to compare it on the merits. Though I do think that, again, in any group of people, you're going to have some who are so far gone that they just look at Ashley Babbitt and they say, well, obviously she's a patriot, and obviously George Floyd is a drug addict. So I don't, there's obviously pure racism at play here for some of the regulars. But I think the big name, the people who are driving this debate online, I think it's mostly just a game, right? And it's useful.
So I have a question, which is like slightly unrelated, but I just want to get to the drug addict point, which is like really striking to me, because when I was talking to some of the people I know who voted for Trump, they said things like, oh, well, Biden's son is a drug addict, and like kind of like casting aside. I'm like, your own family is like, has drug addicts in it. Like, you are like, actually, like, there was like this lack of reflexiveness of like understanding. There was like a condemnation of this and then not realizing it. And once you pointed that out, they were like, oh yes, maybe you're right. That's like kind of cruel of me or inconsistent. But like, what about the opiate addiction reaching all of America, including white America and poor white America, changes the game in some way with policing on some of these issues? I mean, like, I just really wonder.
Yeah, I honestly think that they look at the opioid addiction as a white person's problem. It wasn't their fault. It's like the big pharma, is the fault about this, and that is different than the people who are making a choice to be drug addicts. Honestly,
Jesus.
I think that that's the rationalization. I will say this though.
By the way,
one little.
just want to say to everybody, Tim has talked about this a lot on some of the Bulwark podcasts.
Sorry if I missed it, Tim. I've OD'd on podcasts.
But Tim and JVL have, spent a lot of time on this, on the wild disparity, but with which this political contingent thinks about, white drug addiction and black drug addiction, and it's a really interesting theme that they've talked about a fair bit.
Yeah.
I do just want to say, I'm happy to keep talking about this, but I think that there is one, I want to be not so negative. My thing on this tomorrow, which I wish I would have, co-wrote with Rashawn, because he's got much more depth and, this is a very top level point I'm trying to make tomorrow. But I do think that even among existing Trump voters, so not just my people, not just conservatives who are former, but even among a certain class of existing Trump voters, the George Floyd thing really shook people up. Right. I mean, so like the people we're talking about is a lot of people, millions of people, by the way. But there is a real potential to look at maybe 2/3 of the country, the Biden support plus maybe 10% of the Trump support, and that really want change, and that we're really grossed out by what happened with George Floyd, and that the visual really did make a difference. And so I do think that there is some hope for optimism here. I don't think that this is like the tribalism thing is totally broken down 50-50 on this. I think that there's a hardcore group who are so invested in this war that the facts didn't matter.
Yeah.
And another group that looked at this video and was like, this is just too much.
Yeah.
Charles T., the floor is yours.
Hi, Charles.
I had hoped to ask this question while Rashawn was still here, but no biggie, no worries. What do you guys think of making federal law enforcement training center, or giving it like accreditation responsibilities? Because I've noticed a huge gap between professionalism on the federal level versus at the local level. And then also perhaps emulating foreign models like Germany. My understanding is in Germany, police are required to have 2 years of training before they hit the streets.
Yeah, so this is this is actually a subject I've thought a bit about, and I'm happy to. Unfortunately, I don't think the answer is going to be very reassuring. So the United States has a problem. So first of all, you're right that there is an immense professionalism gap between federal law enforcement, at least elite federal law enforcement, the Bureau, the Secret Service, and a lot of local police departments. Some of the best police departments are much more professional, but there is a huge gap in general between the feds and unfortunately the number of police officers you would have to train to get them up to that standard and the length you would have to do is really substantial. And so the undertaking is an immense one, which is not a reason not to do it. The second and more serious problem is that the feds are getting a little bit of a free ride here because they don't do the kind of, with the exception of, things like CPB, which, they have some problems, right? CBP has some of the same problems that a lot of local law enforcement has. Their professionalism level is lower. Federal law enforcement does not do routine street level interactions with people very much. When the feds break down your door, it's because, they have a very specific reason to be talking to you, arresting you. They're not doing traffic stops. They're not doing street patrols. They're right, these things that are the major friction points that local law enforcement has with communities. The feds just don't have. And so, you have many, many fewer points of contact. And that includes many fewer points of contact at the level of the sort that produce, almost 100% of police shootings or violent confrontations. And so, you know, the bureau people are much less likely to be arresting somebody who for a low-level offense. They're, you know, the interaction between Derek Chauvin and George Floyd is not an interaction that the feds would have with, you know, a suspect for passing a $20 counterfeit bill or whatever it was, right? And so, you know, the problem is both that the degree of the degree of training that it would take to redress this gap is immense, but also that would not change the fact that, you know, you're still having many more friction points between local law enforcement and communities. So training is a big part of the answer, but it's not the entirety of the answer. I mean, you don't want to overstate what you can do with it.
Yeah, no, I understand.
Thank you.
So I want to tell a short story before we have to end, which is just kind of like, in the 70s, let's say a person that I know very well was in law school in Detroit and was pulled over for an expired registration, a white man. And he was pulled over for expired registration, and he was a law student. And he said, "Okay, officer, I'll take the ticket." And the officer said, "No, I'm arresting you. I'm arresting you, and I'm going to like put you in the back of my car." White officer, white, like perp. And the person and the white male, probably kind of asserting his white male privilege in the 70s, was like, "Well, this is like complete bullshit. Like, how can you do this? Like, this is a ticketing offense. This is a violation. Why would you like arrest me for this? Why would you demand that I get bail?" And he's like making a big ruckus in the back of the police car. And finally, the police officer turns around and takes his nightstick and goes right between his eyes, takes the nightstick and goes, "Shut the fuck up." And this story was always told to me as a child as an example of police have a lot of power, and you pay attention to that power, and that there is a lot of power at the end of a nightstick. And eventually that person that was like pulled over was fine. Let's fast forward 30 years after that. A roommate that person had lived with in law school forwarded him a Detroit paper summary of that exact officer who had pulled him over and done this thing to him, beating a homeless man to death on the streets of Detroit. And this type of thing being a story that is just prevalent in police, that there is a bully type of mentality, I think. Not in all police. I think some people go into police to help, but there are a lot of people that there's a culture of bullying and lack of kind of like, regardless of race, if that type of thing was happening, we've never heard about it, and it was white people on white people, like that is bad. But like this, I think that this moment is like, I hope that this is a turning point for how we analyze police force in like the United States.
Yeah. I always connected with the kooky libertarians on this as a bratty, suburban kid who had a few run-ins with the cops and didn't like to call out the cops and watch their, I had the privilege of being able to be a bratty suburban kid who could have run-ins with the cops, but they were assholes. But like, I always connected with like Rand on this, like this was something that I felt very like, it was like when he talks about it, I'm like, I agree with you. Like, and so it's just like, that's why this is sort of what I'm trying to write about tomorrow, is that like, it sucks that this has gotten so wrapped up in this culture war, because like it does feel like there should be a natural conservative impulse against this like power of the state, right? Like the "don't tread on me" ethos should apply here.
It does. It's "don't tread on me, tread on him."
On him, right? Exactly. So like, but it feels close. You know what I mean? It just kind of feels like we could be if we weren't so wrapped around. If it wasn't, obviously the race element is what hangs over all this, but like on the substance of the policy, like that story feels like it should be something that gets other like people like me who used to be Republicans like bristling, like fuck these guys, like we got to change this. Like, this isn't right.
Yeah, I just think that there has been. So I'm just saying that like there is no one that is served, white or black, by this type of blindsidedness, or this like blind eye that we turn towards police And so I just think that this is, I hope this is like the beginning. So
we are going to leave it there. Tim Miller, you're a great American.
You are great Americans.
It is great to see your face. We will be back tomorrow.
Can I just interrupt with one thing before you say we'll be back tomorrow?
Yeah.
Like, now that we're able to travel again kind of soon, you know, but like I am still a parent, and so I need like excuses to like go. If you guys want to host like an in lieu of fun Provincetown week,
oh my God.
in
Miller,
August,
you want to come stay at my house?
where I would
no,
speak
I'm
to a
serious.
small group where I could say,
Oh.
"Ooh, I've got a speaking engagement in Provincetown."
Yeah,
That's
we can do that. Oh my God, I would love to do that. I'm going to be writing a book.
The first
And
thing
that's
that's
not to be
happening
officially said, but yeah.
is the In Lieu of Fun Amtrak trip, which is around
Ben's traveling around the country.
around the country by Amtrak. I'll let you know when I'm going to be, you know, in the Bay Area. But yeah, we are definitely planning In Lieu of Fun meetups, the In Lieu of Fun face licking parties.
Great, I'll do that.
Which are going to happen.
As the only person who has face licked a stranger, I think, in this group. Just saying. I don't know, Tim. I will.
Like, I got you covered.
I guess, what is the definition of stranger? I guess.
Okay, whatever. This is okay. Sorry, we'll like regroup and try to like recover from this.
That was in the history of In Lieu of Fun. That was the
amazing.
best skeptical look we've ever had.
Okay.
All right. We'll be back tomorrow. Who's our guest tomorrow, KK? Do you need a reminder?
Calendar. Liz Baraf-Bonowitz, my friend, who is a cognitive psychology PhD, or not PhD, sorry. She is actually a full professor at Harvard. And so she's going to be on, and she's very funny and amazing and multi-talented and plays the piano and sings in perfect pitch and has written a cover of Madonna's Material Girl sung to the lyrics Empirical Girl. And so I'm just teasing that. How could you miss it? It will be great. Liz is going to be amazing.
It is, and that will be 22 hours and 57 minutes from now. And until then, we don't have fun anymore, but we at least do have one convicted cop, which, is more than we knew 36 hours ago we could actually get. So